Today we have a speaker, Regev, born in Tel Aviv, got a degree in law, and came to the U.S., studied to become the rabbi at the Hebrew
Actually, in Jerusalem.
in
I
Yerushalayim.
went to Jerusalem, and there I studied for the rabbinate at Hebrew Union College on 13 King David Street.
Okay, I didn't know they had one there. So I'm not going to go through much of the introduction. Everybody, I think, already has this. I'm going to let Uri introduce himself. Now he's asked that he do things a little bit differently. He asks that everyone ask questions before he begins talking because the topic is so vast. So let him explain how he wants to do this. I will act as moderator, and everybody is welcome to join in, and please participate. Don't be shy.
Shalom, Boker Tov. Wonderful to be with all of you here and online. I did suggest that we start differently than usually in sessions like this, because I'm afraid that if I start presenting the complex issues that Israel is facing now and that I am focusing on for many years now, we may not get to the point where I'll be able to respond to your questions. I want to make sure that that does not happen. So I'll say something about myself, which I think will convey my focus, and indeed invite you to ask your questions about issues that are of concern to you and you would like me to include in my presentation, because either you have heard the answers before and you didn't feel comfortable, you didn't feel safe, you didn't feel certain about the answers that you got, or possibly you had no one to ask, and you want to use me as a sounding board. So I'll go around and invite questions from you that I will try and remember as I present the issues this morning. I welcome the dialogue. I welcome hearing your comments as much as I welcome hearing myself. I will gladly give you my card after the session and continue the dialogue or respond to further questions or provide you with further documentation as you may be interested in. And for those online, my email address is Uri Regev, my name, URI-REGEV @gmail.com. And I'll be here in the Irvine area until April 20th. So if you want to meet face to face during this time, don't hesitate. I'll welcome the opportunity. So yes, I was born in Tel Aviv, and in many ways a sort of a typical suburb of my generation. My parents were secular. My late grandfather, who passed away when I was very young, was Orthodox. And I found my way to Reform Judaism almost by coincidence when at the age of 16 at the Tel Aviv Secular High School that I attended, participated in an exchange program in partnership with the Reform Movement in America. And I came here for 6 months as a youth grouper. We started out at camp, and then I lived with a family in Canoga Park. That was very different than Canoga Park of today. I'm talking about back in '67. The oranges were just wonderful in the area, and the smell was intoxicating. And Orange Julius was still a big thing. So it was the exposure to American Reform Judaism, to American pluralism, that brought me as a secular Israeli to realize that, Judaism ain't necessarily so, namely, it ain't necessarily the same as what our illustrious leaders were trying to tell us when they decided on the shape and way that Judaism was presented to and was running the affairs of the Jewish community in critical areas such as personal status, marriage and divorce, and Shabbat, and Kashrut, etc. And I realized Judaism had much more to offer and many more angles and ways to relate to it than what I grew up with. Namely, it was an either-or proposition. You were either secular or you were religious. And if you were religious, you were Orthodox. And it was the American pluralism model that attracted me. I did not necessarily fully identify with it, but it attracted me as a relevant model for Israel and Israelis to pursue. And therefore, I combined my two interests in life, namely the law and Judaism, and studied for the something like the ROTC program at Tel Aviv University Law School. And then after I graduated and served for 5 years in the Judge Advocates Division, I moved to Jerusalem and studied for the rabbinate, and combined these two areas of interest in founding the Israel Religious Action Center. That is the public arm of the reform movement in Israel, and is currently titled the Reform Center on Religion and State. And I moved on to head the international reform movement for 7 years, and then in 2009 to found the organization that I'm currently heading, Chidush, which is the Hebrew acronym of the words Chofesh, Dat V'Shivyon, freedom of religion and equality. So it's Chidush, freedom of religion for Israel, and it's an American-Israeli partnership. Our US chair may be known to some of you. He's not a Landsman, but very close. He's a native of Los Angeles, Stanley Gold, who is a great guy, who served as the first Jewish chair of the Board of Governors of USC, president of the Los Angeles Jewish Federation, of Hebrew Union College, and in general, the right guy for the kind of advocacy work that we do, namely advancing religious freedom and equality for all. I'm saying the right guy because when he was elected president of the Jewish Federation, he was interviewed in the J, and not the J, the Jewish Journal. J is San Francisco. The Jewish Journal, and the punchline of the interview with him was the final sentence, which said, "I don't get ulcers, I give ulcers." And in many ways, fighting for religious freedom and equality in Israel takes that kind of a mindset, because it certainly does go against the grain, at least the political grain, not the public grain, as you will shortly see. So the areas I'm interested in, sort of the general title, are anything and everything having to do with Israel's unique identity as a Jewish and democratic state. It sounds so palatable. It flows down your throat great, but it's as complex as a nut. And for many, it has been perceived from the beginning And when I'm saying the beginning, I'm not referring to 1948. While we may think that Jewish and democratic is sort of as as ancient as the Bible, or as ancient as the state of Israel, it was not back in 1948 when the term Jewish and democratic was entered into Israeli law, the Israeli vocabulary. It was rather late, in 1992, when the Knesset adopted what was as close to a Bill of Rights that Israel ever got, namely the 1992 constitutional legislation of the Basic Law on Human Liberty and Dignity. And ever since 1992 until today, and very much today, because that is part of the heart of the current controversy, the constitutional controversy in Israel now, these very days. So in the Basic Law on Human Liberty and Dignity, we see reference to the values of the State of Israel as a Jewish and democratic state. And ever since 1992, there is a legal, political, philosophical, religious, and public debate as to what does it exactly mean. And the truth of the matter is it has never been spelled out. It is understood differently by different people. And sort of a token of that controversy can be seen in the words of two great luminaries in the field of law, the late Deputy Chief Justice Chaim Cohen and the late Deputy Chief Justice Professor Menachem Eilon. And Chaim Cohen grew up ultra-Orthodox, but became sort of a luminary in the secular Jewish field. And Professor Menachem Eilon was a professor of Jewish law and modern Orthodox in his approach. So Chaim Cohen says Jewish and democratic is very clear. Israel is a democratic state, which is Jewish to the extent that Jewish values are in line with democratic principles. And Professor Menachem Eilon suggests, yes, Israel is a Jewish and democratic state. It is first and foremost a Jewish state, and it's democratic to the extent that democratic values are in keeping with Jewish principles. And you can understand, hearing that the controversy is inevitable, and there has not been a resolution of what that formula really means, and it has not been legislated, it has not been fully interpreted until today, and it keeps coming back to bite us. And that is to a great degree at the heart, as I said, of the current controversy over the constitutional initiatives that the government has been advancing, pushing, and the public protest movement is refusing to accept. So before I move further into laying out some of the foundations of the conversations, some of the challenges, some of the issues that we at Chidush are dealing with, I want to repeat my invitation. If there are specific issues that have been of concern to you, of interest to you, in this general area of Israel as a Jewish and democratic state, please raise them, and I want to make it very clear. When we founded Chidush, we founded it with the expressed commitment and intention to focus solely on issues of religion and state, religious freedom, equality, and not touch issues of settlements and peace process and economic philosophies, etc. Not because we don't have views on those issues. On the contrary, we have very strong views, possibly divergent views, but very strong views. But what we wanted was to give expression to a reality which not everybody understands. There is widespread support for religious freedom and equality in Israel. I'll quote some of the numbers. There is a majority support for religious freedom and equality in Israel that ranges from the left to the center, and yes, in the right political wing as well. Once you bring onto the platform, onto the stage, additional issues such as settlement, such as peace, such as economic philosophies, you start losing that wide-based support. And we acknowledge the fact that the distinction, that the controversy between left and right in Israel, which is primarily over issues of territories, over the peace process, over security. We acknowledge the fact that to a great degree, the division between left and right is a legitimate division. It is not just picked up from thin air. There are real concerns, and there are concerns that deserve to be considered, addressed, and responded to. I'm not talking about the messianics. I'm not talking about the extremists. I'm talking about mainstream right wing, mainstream left wing, which have legitimate claims regarding their respective approaches to settling the issues of the territories and peace and security. So we don't get involved in those issues and don't expect me to be able to shed much light about those differences. So with that in mind, and looking at Israel as a Jewish and democratic state in conceptual perspective, philosophical, religious, political, and specifically all issues involving religion and state in Israel, and by extension, issues that impact on world Jewry, on Israel diaspora partnership, on civil liberties in Israel. I would be welcoming any questions and try to address them. So,
let's do it this way. First of all, those people on Zoom, please raise your hand so we can recognize you, and I will call you, and then you will unmute yourself and ask your question. We have several questions here, and I think the first one is, was it Jack or John? I forgot who. Okay, go. One second, let me get the microphone.
Hi, is this working better? Okay, I see. I just returned from Israel, having been there in the days leading up to when the protests were happening, when the announcements were made to delay the decision making. The question I have is, do you believe that in today's Israel that the population has shifted in terms of the universal population to a much more religious perspective, and that if they were to re-vote today for prime minister, that they would still hold the same people in office that they have right now?
I get a lot of that.
A few questions.
Oh, you want more questions?
I don't mind. And you know what? Let me try and respond shortly. I am not sure that I'll succeed, but let me try. And if I don't succeed, my wife will give me the sign. The answer is twofold. In general, Israeli population, according to our annual Religion and State Index, which is a major, unique study that we do since the inception of Chidush in 2009, where we cover all questions of religion and state. So when we ask Israelis, and that's a point that you really, and I apologize, that will take a couple minutes because it's important and it's not just in response to your question. It's part of the sort of foundational background. Two questions that we have been asking since 2009. One is, how do you define yourself politically? Where do you place yourself? Center, right of center, right, left of center, left. And where do you put yourself religiously? Secular, traditional, not so religious, traditional leaning toward religious, Haredi, ultra-Orthodox. Now, these two subgroups of traditional is not because we chose it this way, but because the Central Bureau of Statistics in Israel about 15 to 20 years ago instituted that subdivision, which has become extremely helpful in understanding the nature of the Israeli traditionalist or traditional Jewish population. So here is the first and most important thing to realize. Consistently for some years now, when you ask the question, how do you define yourself politically? About 64-65% identify themselves as being right of center. Only about 14 to 15% identify themselves as being left of center. Please bear that in mind. You do not understand where Israeli Jewish population is today without understanding that. The overwhelming majority, some 2/3 of the adult Jewish population in Israel, sees itself politically as being right of center. When you ask the question, where do you place yourselves religiously? What you find is about 65% identifying themselves as either secular or traditional, not so religious, which is a significant subgroup because on most public policy issues involving issues of religion and state, they share the views of the secular. So approximately 65% say we are secular, most of them, about 49%, 50% are saying we are secular, and about 15% are saying we are traditional and not so religious. Only about 22% are identifying themselves as ultra-Orthodox or Orthodox. So what you have is a reversal of the breakdown. On political issues, namely, mostly issues of security and settlements, most Israeli Jews today are on the right. Some of them moderate right, some of them less moderate right, but right. On religion and state issues, most Israelis, including, as I said before, people from the left, center, and yes, the right, are on the side of religious freedom. When we ask the question, do you support freedom of religion and equality? And we quote from the Declaration of Independence of the State of Israel, which says the State of Israel will be based upon the precepts of liberty, justice, and peace as taught by the Hebrew prophets, will ensure freedom of religion and conscience, will uphold will uphold full social and political equality regardless of religion, gender, or race. That is the heart of the operative clause of the Declaration of Independence. When we ask about, do you support freedom of religion and equality becoming the norm in Israel? You find about 80% saying yes. Interestingly, 80% because many in the religious or even Haredi are supporting that because they think of themselves. They don't feel that they enjoy enough religious freedom. The Haredi want to, for instance, be able to get more money. They want to be able to get more acknowledgement of their exemption from military service because of their religious views, etc., etc. So 80% say yes, freedom of religion and equality. So when you ask your question, the interesting answer is, and it's not my answer, but recent polls in the last, 2 weeks are showing a shift in the projections, the election projections, namely, whom would you be voting for now, and who is your ideal or ultimate candidate for prime ministership? It used to be consistently for some time now that the Likud was the largest faction that gained support among Israelis. And it was the largest faction in the Knesset. And it used to be that Netanyahu consistently got the higher ratings as the ultimate candidate for prime minister in Israel. In the last couple of weeks, that's changing. And the Likud is on the descent. Interestingly, Benny Gantz's Hamachaneh Mamlachti, the National Camp, or whatever it's called in English, is on the rise for a number of reasons. And for the first time in a long time, both Gantz and Lapid have higher ratings in the polls than Netanyahu does. The bottom line is that from a majority of 64 that the current coalition enjoys, 64 is a small, fragile majority. I mean, we need to understand that, and that to a great degree is behind some of the crisis that we now have. Because any one faction in the current coalition can pull the rug from under the government and bring it down. So poor Netanyahu has to cater to each and every one of them, because every one of them can end his career as prime minister. And that's why we find some aberrations in recent days regarding the decisions and allocations and initiatives, etc. So for the first time, from a majority of 64 that the coalition has enjoyed for some time, we now see that the coalition partners rank only 58 out of the 120. So there is an understanding that the send is shifting. And what all of that means in real life, will there be elections? When will there? I mean, of course, the hope is that there will be elections, though some of the fear of some in Israel is that the initiatives that are brought forth by Minister of Justice Levine and the chair of the Law and Constitution Committee, Rothman, are hiding in the back additional initiatives that may not introduce such free elections as Israel has been accustomed to. And the models of not just Russia, but Poland and Hungary are, of course, extremely alarming ones. Will there be elections? When will the elections be held? How will the public feel about it? All of that, of course, remains to be seen. I'm sorry for a much longer response that I promised or intended, but it really is important to understand that when you look at where do Israelis stand, the claim of the coalition, the claim of the religious parties, that the elections were a resounding endorsement of their vision of a Jewish and democratic state, their vision of traditionalism and religion instead of the promiscuous secularity, all of that is baloney.
Thank you for the short answer. It was very clear and precise. Okay. Do you want to have several questions asked at you at first? And then, okay, then we'll start off with Martin. Then I'll walk that way to Mark and then back to you.
My question was answered.
I know Herb Lieberman is asking about the why publicity, and that I don't think is really tied to the issues we have at hand right now.
I'll try for something simpler. Okay, I will try for something a little simpler. I was in Jerusalem this last summer. I'm not allowed to pray at the Temple Mount. That doesn't sound like freedom of religion to me. It sounds like a relic from the past. We all celebrated when they sounded the shofar, and we marched into Jerusalem. And what we got was a shunda. We're not really allowed to use the Temple Mount.
My question is in regards to the Jewish community here. Okay, my question is in regards to the Jewish community in the United States. In my mind, and you know as much as I know, Israel is on fire in many levels. Yet all I get from my Jewish community is recipes for hum and tashin. So I wanted to know, what should a Jewish community do, say, who should it say to, or should we just keep quiet and march on?
Okay. I have a question also, myself. Yeah, I know, he does too. I've heard some talks by some Reform rabbis, and to be honest, I was kind of shocked because they were it sounded like they were making the political issue greater than the religious issue. In other words, you shouldn't go to Israel because the politics are so far to the right and against us Reform people. And you shouldn't support this. And you should, and in other words, it looked like she was trying to isolate the American community from the Jewish community. And I've heard another person speak recently who kind of did the same thing. And I don't believe that's the belief of the Reformed community, but I want to ask you about it anyways. And now you can talk.
As part of the pause in the constitutional question was the formation of this national police force. Can you comment on that and what implications it may have for the protesters?
Is that enough questions?
Yeah. And then we'll turn to, okay. Thank you. I'll try and remember all four. You are right. It is a simple question. Tough, but simple. Let there be no misunderstanding. Chidush stands for freedom of religion and equality. And definitely, freedom of religion should have entailed freedom of worship on the Temple Mount. But here is the dilemma. And I didn't know where you were going. You started asking, why wasn't I able to pray on the Temple Mount? I, for a second, was thinking you were going to ask the more common question that I'm confronting. Why wasn't I able to pray at the Western Wall with my congregation, with my family? But you didn't ask about that. So here are the two situations. Conservative, Reform, Reconstructionist, Renewal groups, families, come to the Western Wall, ironically, by the way, much more than Israelis do. It's ironic because for the average Israeli, the wall has been hijacked, and the average Israeli has very little remaining interest in the wall. There is the famous iconic photograph of David Rubinger from '67, the paratroopers, with the wall at the background, they freed the Kotel. They freed the Kotel, and the paratroopers have come out a few years ago already in support of the women of the wall and had sort of a similar picture recreated, demonstrating their support for their plea for freedom of worship at the wall. The feeling is the paratroopers did not free the Kotel so that the chief rabbinate and the Chabad Lubavitch rabbi of the Kotel, Rabbi Simcha, his name will come back to me, would be able to force discriminatory and exclusionary worship and visit policies at the wall. So most Israelis have just turned their back and they don't bother coming to the wall. You are describing the Rabinovich, that's right. Rabinowitz. Ironically, by the way, again, it's the curse of mixing religion and politics. Curse. And the drafters of the First Amendment really knew what they were talking about and what risk, what threat needed to be avoided. Here, the First Amendment. In Israel, the Declaration of Independence, as I quoted to you, promises freedom of religion and conscience and equality to all, but again, ironically, to a great degree, Jews enjoy less religious freedom in Israel than non-Jews. If you, I'm sure, find it hard to fathom. So the question of freedom of worship at the wall, for most Israelis, represents a bigger issue that, from their perspective, means the wall has been hijacked and we have other areas to be interested in. The festive event of Yom Yerushalayim, Kafchet B'Iyar, which follows on Yom HaAtzmaut, the sort of the conquest of the old city, that is celebrated as Yom Yerushalayim, as Jerusalem Day. Over the years, if you watch footage from the celebrations include a flag march, a demonstrative, daring flag march, which from the perspective of the celebrants represents their celebration of freedom and conquest and ownership, and it's held through the Muslim quarter because that's where they want to assert their ownership and their conquest. So threatening songs, humiliating songs are often integrated into that march, the flag march. So hundreds or thousands of flags are being raised, and you look at the segment of population that celebrates that Jerusalem Day, and you realize from 1967, when the whole nation celebrated the unification of Jerusalem, it is now a sectarian celebration of the nationalist religious segment in Israeli society. For better or for worse, that's where we are, which, going back to your question, does not make the challenge that you present go away. So we have two instances of the question of freedom of worship. One is at the lower part of that mount, namely the Kotel, where egalitarian groups and the women of the wall wish to pray either in an egalitarian form, family being together next to each other at the wall, touching the wall, putting their notes in the wall, either egalitarian or as women's minyanim, being able to read from the Torah aloud and celebrate the worship. In the case of women of the wall, it's the new moon, the Rosh Chodesh service every year, which they are doing now for some 40 years. They are not able to do that. Why aren't they able to do that? They aren't able to do that because fellow Jews prevent them from doing that. Because fellow Jews who hold the view that it's their way or no way insist on the Kotel being dominated by extreme Orthodox authorities, which exclude the possibility of pluralism, feminism, egalitarianism, and therefore the state at their command, prevents Reform rabbis, conservative, reconstructionists, etc., and others who wish to hold the same worship service that they hold here at home, to be able to hold it at the place that they, not Israelis, but you American Jews, look up to the wall as the most important historic relic of that glorious era. And therefore, most American Jewish groups that come to Israel want to visit the wall and want to visit either Masada or Yad Vashem, but the wall is that shining top site that groups plan to visit when they come on pilgrimage or visits to Israel. And that's where they are denied their ability to feel at home, to feel Jewish, in the same way that they are able to here or elsewhere in the world. And then at the top of the mountain, those who feel religiously committed to be able to worship at the Temple Mount are also unable to do that. But whereas at the bottom of the hill, the blocking stone, the prohibition emanates from fellow Jews who feel that pluralism is an anathema. At the top of the mountain, it is because of the hostile Islamic sentiments that are being ignited by interested parties that want to ignite the fire of war and rejection of Israel altogether. And the bottom line is, who doesn't want Jews to pray at the Temple Mount? I said it has to do with Islamic threats. But who doesn't let Jews pray at the Temple Mount? Interesting, two elements come together. One is the Israeli Chief Rabbinate. The Israeli Chief Rabbinate has decades ago ruled, supported by most of the rabbinic authorities of ultra-Orthodoxy and of the Chief Rabbinate sort of related circles, that it is religiously prohibited to pray on the Temple Mount. The Chief Rabbinate has repeatedly issued statements condemning Ben-Gvir, Itamar Ben-Gvir, the current Minister of National Security, for defying their ruling and going on to the Temple Mount. So it's a very interesting anomaly. People like Ben-Gvir want to go and pray at the Temple Mount, claiming religious freedom, but in doing so, they defy the religious edicts of the Chief Rabbinate in Israel. So on the one hand, there is this interesting dilemma, which I have no idea how you feel about it. I am committed to religious freedom. So as far as I'm concerned, you want to pray on the Temple Mount, you should in principle be able to do so, regardless of what the Chief Rabbinate says. Actually, I would have expected Ben-Gvir and others to join our efforts fighting for religious freedom, because the Chief Rabbinate is at the crux of denying religious freedom from so many Israelis, and there should be, the joining of forces of different victims of that policy, regardless of whether we are on the pluralistic side or on the fundamentalist religious side. But the other element that prevents it is the government. Not I, not the Muslims, but the Israeli government. And the Israeli government prevents it because all the security forces are in consent that regardless of whether it's right or wrong, and it's probably wrong, regardless of whether it's right and wrong, the Temple Mount has become the explosive, what do you call it? In a bomb, you have the, detonator. Has become the detonator, the most potent, explosive detonator that could potentially and realistically bring about a 200 million Muslim nation war or going to war on the Jewish state. Because somehow, and it's so ironic, because the parallel of that is what happens in the ultra-Orthodox community, and the thousands of ultra-Orthodox women who are bussed to the Temple Mount, to the Kotel, in order to spit and make noise and prevent the women of the wall from praying. It's a parallel sentiment of fundamentalists, Muslim fundamentalists and Jewish fundamentalists. They both have identified the wall or the Temple Mount, and they are directly related as this potent unifying force against your perceived enemy. So, what's the difference? We know, and you know it as well, we cherish freedom of expression, and yet we understand that the freedom to shout fire in a loaded, closed theater is justified when you are balancing public threat and freedom of expression. So the government and the Supreme Court felt that putting religious freedom aside, the national threat is so great as to justify halting this religious freedom. So you asked a simple question. The simple answer is, I'm 100% with you. In a proper, balanced world, Jews and Arabs should be able to pray side by side without excluding each other on the Temple Mount. In a real world where the security threats are not imaginary and where those who are raising them are not far, extreme leftists, I think that there is the balancing act that has to be borne in mind, and I would not rule it as irrelevant or irrational or immoral. At the same time, I would not accept that answer when it comes to pluralism and the women of the wall at the Kotel. There, it is not a 200 million Islamic nation that's about to launch a war against the Jews, against Israel. It is a containable, ultra-Orthodox Israeli community that is not limiting its wrath to the wall, but is blocking the implementation of the very principles of freedom of religion and equality in Israel, and therefore giving in at the wall is about giving in regarding the soul, the backbone, and the future of Israel as a Jewish and democratic state. I'm not suggesting that the women of the wall or pluralistic groups somehow exclude others from their ability to worship at the wall. What I'm saying is it's the role of the police, it's the role of the government to ensure that all Jews have a home, a spiritual home, a religious home in Israel. And balancing that conflict is essential as well. Now, there were three other questions. Remind me.
Mine was the the overlap of politics into religious thought regarding Reform Judaism.
Yes, okay. I don't know the specific rabbis that you are referring to, and your question is connected to the question that you asked about the Jewish community in America.
Right.
I mentioned that in 1967 I came here as an exchange student at the age of 16. I remember vividly my views then as a 16-year-old, being exposed to the American Jewish community, and ever since then, my views have been that the relationship between Israel and the diaspora should be based on a model of partnership. And as partnerships go, they're not necessarily equal. They don't necessarily require that each of the partners has the same powers or the same areas of focus, but it's about partnership. I think that the reaction of the most of the leadership of the Jewish community in America today, in North America, I've just seen a statement issued by hundreds of Canadian Jewish leaders, is sad and indicative of both lack of understanding of what is at the heart of the current constitutional conflict and lack of understanding or buying into the notion of partnership. They are exactly as you described, maybe not just recipes for Homentaschen. Actually, they do, in recent weeks, include statements regarding the need to enter into a dialogue and be, embracing the president's initiative and, roadmap, and commending Netanyahu for suspending the legislation and urging the protest movement to enter into the dialogue and let's reach compromise, etc., etc. Nothing on the merits. And there is very little on the merits because there is very little understanding of what's at stake, really. Now, compare that to what I just heard 2 or 3 days ago, the famous historian, philosopher Yuval Noah Harari described in a podcast on March 31st, described in a podcast saying the current crisis is the most important historical challenge that Israel is facing since its inception in 1948. Basically saying there is no going. Israel has 2 ways that it can embrace. It can deteriorate into more of a dictatorship, not more of a dictatorship. It can deteriorate in the direction of a dictatorship, or it can recreate a social contract that will strengthen and enhance Israel's core civil liberties. I think to a great degree that is a true assertion. Now, I don't know the Reform rabbis that you are referring to, but I think that most of them do not fully understand, most of them, not just Reform rabbis, but most of the American Jewish leadership, do not fully understand the dichotomy or the anomaly that I referred to at the beginning of my presentation. Namely, politically, most Israelis are on the right of center. They weren't that way in the first decades of the history of the State of Israel. When Labor again and again won the elections, there was need for a coalition. It never won alone. But it was a labor-oriented government for decades. So it wasn't that way in the past. It may not be that way in the future, but it is that way for some years now and probably for some more years to come. Why? Because fear has entered into the hearts of many Israelis. That fear, to some degree, has been stoked. And whatever it is, it's there. The Palestinians have not made it easy. There is mistrust. There is mistrust on both sides. But politically, I think it's important for American Jews to understand that for Israel, the threat, the risk is not abstract. The threat and the risk is to the lives of Israelis, the lives of our children, of our grandchildren. It is different than sharing a moral and reasoned opinion regarding what risks Israel should be taking when you are sitting in Irvine. I'm not saying that there shouldn't be that reasoned discussion in Irvine. What I'm saying is that there should be an extent of modesty when entering into that question and factoring in not just the ailments of Israeli occupation, but also the difficulty in, for instance, gaining acknowledgement of the legitimacy of a Jewish state. Now, here is the great irony, because many reject the legitimacy of a Jewish state in any shape or form, and at the same time are on the forefront of fighting for the right of a Palestinian state. Now, mind you, the basic law of the Palestinian Authority is that Palestinian law will be based on the Sharia. So here is a Palestinian national state in the making, anchored in a commitment to uphold religious Muslim law, and the same people who deny the legitimacy of a Jewish and democratic state are on the forefront of fighting for the legitimacy and actually the demand to establish a national Palestinian state. That, in my book, is incompatible. So the political issues are complex, and they should be treated as complex. It's not that one side has it right and the other side has it all wrong. But whereas we are not confronted by the same security risks, though anti-Semitism is rearing its ugly head here, and anti-Semitic incidents are threatening and alarming, but we are not facing the same risks. And hopefully we will never face the same risks again. But there is one area in which we are on the same page. And that is in this equation, Jewish and democratic, democratic and Jewish. State of Israel, when it was founded, promised freedom of religion and conscience, full equality regardless of religion. That is something that actually both the overwhelming majority of American Jews and the overwhelming majority of Israeli Jews are on the same page. Who is not on the same page? Israeli politicians. Now that's a breed all of its own. And let me give you a figure now, because I will mention it later. I'm trying to watch your eyes. When I see your eyes closing, I'll realize that there is a threat to my ability to continue the session, but you're holding on fine. So one of the claims that the current government is raising as a key flag to justify their judicial reform is what? They're doing it for the sake of the courts, because the courts are losing public trust, and they're concerned about it. So their reform is intended to reinstate and strengthen public trust in the courts. Sounds great, doesn't it? Actually noble. They are often using the term judicial dictatorship to describe the current conduct of the Israeli Supreme Court. So the current conduct of the Israeli Supreme Court is judicial dictatorship. That term, by the way, is heard sometimes among the civilian coalition parties, namely Likud leaders, but mostly among the religious coalition partners, the ultra-Orthodox parties. Judicial dictatorship. So they say, and rightly so, people are losing faith in the court. And our reform is intended to reinstate that faith. Now, let's look at the figures. A couple months ago, the Israel Democracy Institute has published its annual Israel Democracy Index. And it includes fascinating data. One of them is your level of trust in Israeli public institutions. The top, and what they're pointing to is in 2022, there is less public Jewish trust in all the public institutions. There is decreasing public trust. But the order of the institutions remained the same. So at the top, and I'm looking at the 2022 data. At the top of public trust is, what do you think? IDF. So IDF has 85% trust level. Second, President of Israel, 62%. Third, the Supreme Court, 42%. Now let's look at the government, 24%. The Knesset, 18.5%. Israeli parties, 8.5%. Now, this is not enough. Let's look at another figure which they have not pointed to, but I'm pointing to. They compared it to the multi-year average between 2003 and 2022. So let's look at how much was the descent between the multi-year average and last year's figures. So, yes, the Supreme Court has come down from 59.5% trust level, which is the multi-year figure, to 42%. That's a significant decrease. But in percentages, what decrease is it? 30%. 30% decrease this year compared to the multi-year level. Government, down from 37.3% to 24%. Percentage of decrease, 36%. The Knesset, down from 36.1% to 18.5%, 49% decrease. The parties down from 21.2 to 8.5%, 60% decrease. So here are our illustrious coalition leaders decrying the decline in trust of the public in the Supreme Court. And we are here to help, because the Supreme Court has to be strengthened and back on the horse. With all due respect, the public has lost more trust in you, the government, you, the Knesset, you, the parties. And you know what? When you worry about public trust, first reinstate the trust in what you are doing before you're coming to fix the trust in somebody else. Moreover, when the question was asked, do you agree that the Supreme Court should have the authority to overrule laws that are legislated by the Knesset, which are contrary to the Chukei HaYesod, the basic laws of the State of Israel? Now, this is fascinating because this is, of course, one of the specific elements of the judicial reform that Levin and Rothman are trying to push. Interestingly, from 2010, when that question was asked, until now, and there is a cross-section of the results, almost consistent. 54 to 57% support that the Supreme Court should have the authority to overrule laws that are contrary to the basic laws. The public wants exactly what the government does not want. Now, when we look at the breakdown, I say 54 to 57%, when you look at the breakdown, so I told you before about the secular and the traditional non-religious, which make up about 65% of Israeli society. Well, 76% of the secular and 56% of the traditional not religious say, yes, the Supreme Court should have that authority. And when you look at the Likud, even within the Likud, there are more who agree that the Supreme Court should have that authority than those who disagree. And I could go on to the specific other proposals that the government is trying to initiate, with the common denominator that the majority of the public is opposed to them. The majority of the public is opposed to them. The majority of the public is opposed to Deri being reinstated as minister in spite of the Supreme Court ruling that a crook guy that was already convicted 3 times should not be serving as a minister in the cabinet, certainly not the Minister of Interior Affairs controlling the finances and the conduct of all of Israel's local governments. So it's important for American jury to understand this isn't just 2 points of view that are conflicting, and let's work out a compromise. You know, all right, let's cut it in the middle. We get half, you get half. That's not the issue. So what American jury may do, and what Reform rabbis and other rabbis may do, is first to have a better understanding of what's at stake here, and then figure out what is our role. And I'm saying that, from my perspective, already back in '67 and onwards, the partnership model has provided me with insight as to what we should be doing. Let me give you a more relevant analogy. One of the landmark cases that I won before the Israeli Supreme Court on who is a Jew, representing Reform and conservative converts to Judaism, against the Ministry of the Interior that refused to accept them as Jews, was the leading opinion at the time was written by the then Chief Justice, Professor Aharon Barak. Now, the reason I'm alluding to it is that there is a paragraph in his ruling which has not been sufficiently understood, perceived, or appreciated. And I think it's really a key. He says, why does the state refuse to accept Reform and conservative conversions as recognized? He says, and I'm quoting, the state of Israel maintains that all the Jews in Israel constitute one Jewish community, quote unquote, and that the helm of this Jewish community, quote unquote, stands in the religious realm, the chief rabbinate, and therefore, to be accepted as a member of the Jewish community, quote unquote, you need the consent of the chief rabbinate. Says Chief Justice Barak, this contention is unacceptable to us. It is true that the term Jewish community appears in Israeli law, quote unquote, but it is mandatory colonial in nature, mandatory with a capital M, namely dating back to the British mandate over Palestine. It is mandatory colonial in nature and has no place in the modern sovereign state of Israel. The state of Israel, says Barak, is not the state of the Jewish community, quote unquote. It is the state of the Jewish people. And the state of the Jewish people should make it possible. The Jewish people has many denominations and movements and views within it. And each and every Jew and each and every person, he says, should be able to freely choose which denomination, which movement to affiliate with. That short paragraph has not been circulated widely enough. I wish the leaders of the Jewish community, I wish that more of my Reform colleagues, conservative colleagues, etc., started out with that notion. Israel is the state of the Jewish people. Surely those that vote in its elections are Israeli citizens. But you are called upon to lend your support, your moral support, your political support, your financial support. With what right do we come to you to ask for your support? Yes, call of history, Jewish destiny, all of that is true, but all of that anchors into the notion of we are one. Israel is our joint enterprise. And if it's our joint enterprise, certainly we may not be able to vote, but this entails certain rights and responsibilities. And the responsibilities go beyond sending out Hamantaschen recipes. And more than just saying, gee, can't we be nicer to each other? Can't we enter into a dialogue, open-ended dialogue? Let's talk for years. That's not the way that we are going to resolve these conflicts. These are real conflicts. Well, we'll talk afterwards. The point is, and I related to your two questions, but there was one more question that I did not relate to, which was that?
Had to do with the ruling during the pause of the National Police Force.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. Well, listen, you can read about that. I mean, on the one hand, what is this about? People are saying, potentially, this is about a private militia that's going to be, headed and governed by a former Kahana, disciple, who has, been convicted of terror activities, etc., etc. It's a serious situation. The more the other opponents of this are saying, what are you talking about? There are thousands of police positions that are unfilled. Fill them before you say you can't fill, you can't do your job, and therefore we have to add, a layer of, National Guard. I don't want to relate to the details because it really takes me off the main thrust of my message.
I know we have some chats, and I read through them, and I apologize, but we were talking about religious freedom, and the chats tend to be more political. So I'm not ignoring you because I'm ignoring you, but because I think that your topics are off track of what we were talking about.
All right. In that case, let me go back for one more point, and then I see that. Okay, but let me go back for one more point, because I was sort of going around it and not touching it right at the heart. I mentioned that one of the claims for launching this judicial reform initiative is the need to reinstate the trust in the Supreme Court. As Prime Minister Netanyahu quoted the American Constitution, we the people, taking back power from the court to the people. This is a camouflage. What we are dealing with is a masquerade party. There is no genuine interest in looking at an improved system of the rule of law. The truth behind it, and I said I'm going to be fair but not impartial. The truth behind it is that there is a majority in the government for pushing the judicial reform as its first and primary governmental initiative. All the other issues, social issues, welfare issues, have been pushed to the side. The legislative agenda has been taken over by the different elements of the judicial reform, quote unquote, initiative. Rothman, the chair of the Law and Constitution Committee, has piled on numerous meetings of the committee to go through the different details of this legislation, etc., holding sessions on Sundays and Thursdays that are a no-no in the normal course of the work of the Knesset, holding sessions late at night, sometimes throughout the night, all of that in order to try and push a blitz initiative to change Israel's governmental system. Now, I'm saying it's camouflage. I'm saying it's a mask party, a masquerade party. What is behind it? There are two, only somewhat overlapping, but mostly different reasons, motivations that are behind this reform. One has to do with the extreme political right. I've written an op-ed, I'll gladly share it with you, about the Minister of Finance and also the Minister in the Defense Ministry, Bezalel Smotrich, head of Otzma Yehudit, head of the ultra-Orthodox Zionist party. My op-ed took off from his outrageous endorsement of, and then he tried to back off from that, but took his time and did a very unsatisfactory job of backing out, namely his endorsement of the call to wipe out Hawara, the Hawara village that after the horrific murder of the Israeli couple that drove through Hawara, which is a busy road in the northern part of the Samaria. So that night, even though the murderer was not from Hawara, that night, settlement hoodlums embarked on Hawara and started burning down homes and arsoning and burning down cars. I think about 38 homes and about 100 cars. And by one casualty, and by sheer luck, others have been rescued from their burning homes without being burned down. So following that, there was this period of debate, wipe out Hawara. Now, what I pointed out in the op-ed was that for Smotrich, Bezalel Smotrich, this was not sort of an isolated statement. Because back in 2017, Smotrich laid down his vision for what he called HaTochnit HaMachat, the definitive solution. The definitive solution. And if anybody will be thinking of another solution that we know from our history, it may not be a total coincidence. So the definitive solution basically laid out his vision of resolving the Arab-Jewish conflict, Arab-Israeli conflict. Basically giving the Arabs three options. Now that's both Israeli Arabs and Palestinians. Three options. One is to acknowledge, you give up any notion of national aspirations. No national aspirations. If that is something you are willing to genuinely accept, then you will be receiving a level of self-governance, not a state, but self-governance and municipal issues. And of course, you would be in an under level or lower level of residency compared to Jews. That lower level is important, and he was quoting Maimonides and other sources, that Arabs should not have the same rights and status as Jews. That is for those who are willing to give up all notion of independence and national acknowledgement. Those who are not willing to would be suggested to leave the country. And actually, they will be helped to leave the country. They'll be given, offers they won't be able to refuse. And for those who will not give in regarding their national aspirations, nor willing to leave the country in which they have been living for hundreds of years, then the third phase is the army will take care of them. And in some other discussion, he was asked, but what about women and children? And his answer was, he was quoting the French, A war like a war. In a war like a war. Well, there's a French phrase saying that. In a war like a war. Namely, too bad. That's what happens in a war. These are his thought through public vision for how to resolve the Jewish-Arab conflict. Now, think a minute about what lies behind it. Clearly, this is not something he would able to implement in a country in which the Supreme Court has the authority to monitor and oversee and pass judicial review on both government illegal actions and Knesset illegal unconstitutional legislation. Impossible. Would Israel remain a democracy if it turned out that Arabs in Israel would enjoy less rights than Jews? There is no real democracy in the world in which citizens can be divided in terms of the full-right citizens and second-rate citizens who do not enjoy rights. So what do you do? And he's not alone. What do? You have this grand vision. You know what the obstacle is. You know that you can twist the arms of your fellow political partners. What do? Well, the answer is very simple. You have to neuter the Supreme Court. You cannot afford to have an independent, authoritative Supreme Court. So here is the extreme messianic right-wingers who have come to the conclusion the enemy and the blockade is the Supreme Court, and therefore forget about reinstate public trust, forget about improving governance, forget about we the people. The target is the Supreme Court. And then there is a second partner, the ultra-Orthodox parties. The ultra-Orthodox parties, for decades now, have targeted the Supreme Court. You may not know, but back in the, I guess it was the 70s, when Aaron Barak became the Supreme Court Chief Justice, and the Supreme Court took on issues of draft of yeshiva students, of pluralistic appointments to the religious councils in Israel. There was a mass demonstration against the Supreme Court a few years later, hundreds of thousands of ultra-Orthodox with the chief rabbis of Israel, etc. But even before that, and the then head of Shas, former chief rabbi Ovadia Yosef, was declaring the Supreme Court justices are the root reason for all the evils in the world. They call themselves the Supreme Court, but they are the lowest court. They are servants who are trying to rule us. Before that already, there were threats on the life of Aaron Barak. And at that time, for the first time in Israel's history, there was need for bodyguards to be assigned to serve, to safeguard the life of the Chief Justice. And that has remained ever since then. That was the background to the threats on the life of the Supreme Court Chief Justice. So for decades now, they have identified the Supreme Court as the target of their inability to get their way from their coalition partners. And what is their way? Mass exemptions for yeshiva students from IDF or national service. And here is the reality. The reality is that the governments, left, center, and right, and it should be understood, my message is not directed against the right. That has happened under the rule of left governments, of center governments, and on right governments. Because they have all, politicians, have all preferred the ability to horse trade, concessions on civil liberties and public dignity, human dignity, in return for votes, rather than find a way of having the right of center and the center on the left of center, civil parties, come together for a common agenda which the overwhelming majority of the public supports and wants. All polls show the public wants a civil wide government from right to the center and some of the left. That's the preference of the public. And instead of that, they each in turn try to cater to the ultra-Orthodox parties in order to bring them on board and have a shaky, fragile majority, which requires that they give in to every extortionist move that these parties dream up. So yes, the Supreme Court has repeatedly ruled the mass exemption laws for yeshiva students as unconstitutional. It's given the government and the Knesset plenty of time to come back with a more equitable, more balanced law. And the government has never taken up this opportunity because they couldn't. Because for the Haredi parties, it is not a question of whether 2,000 will serve or 5,000 will serve. It's the principle that no yeshiva student that doesn't want to serve will be forced to serve. And when the suggestion was, all right, maybe we can't force him to serve, but at least let's remove his subsidies because we are dealing with billions of shekels. Let's remove his subsidies. The answer of the Haredi party is no. No removal of subsidies. Actually, in the coalition agreements leading to the formation of this government, you'll double the subsidies. So the Supreme Court on the draft law and on issues of Shabbat, and now pending is the Kotel pluralism worship issue, and on issues of co-curricular studies, and the issue of public funding and preferential public funding, etc., and kashrut, and the monopoly over kashrut. On all of these issues, it has been one and only block or blockade, the Supreme Court. So now go back in your own mind. Here is the Smotrich and his gang saying we can't afford an independent Supreme Court if we are to be able to implement our vision of greater Israel, of annexing the territories, of increasing the settlements. Supreme Court is just, has to be set aside. We tried to intimidate it. It didn't help. So we are now trying to do away with it. How do we do away with it? Variety of ways. We'll control the appointments of the justices. We'll control their ability to pass judicial review on laws, to pass judicial government decisions. And then even if they go through all of that and still rule against what we want to achieve, we have the override clause, namely any ruling of the Supreme Court we can override by a majority of 61. Of course, you can't have a government without a minimum of 61. So now we have the perfect system that is aimed at completely and fully neutralizing the Supreme Court. And the next time they tell you, no, it's about perfecting the Israeli legal system. It's about improving the rule of law. It's about bringing the power back to the people. You tell them, we know a little bit about democracy too. We know about the importance of an independent, authoritative judiciary as an integral part of democracy and the separation of powers. We know about the needs for checks and balances. We know that what's behind it is nothing noble, nothing abstract, but a sheer attempt to redefine Israel as a Jewish and democratic state that's going to be possibly more Jewish, their version, but definitely less democratic, the world's democratic version. So with that, what I'm saying is, I do appeal to the leadership of the Jewish community. And I'm appealing to you not to do us favors, but to recognize your role as partners, your roles as those who are going to be affected, short-term and long-term, by the way that Israel is going to shape up. You cannot talk seriously about the future of the Jewish people today without talking about the role of Israel. More children are born to the Jewish people today in Israel than in all the rest of the world put together. We are in it, whether we like it or not, together. And if in your business choices, you take care of your investments, you take care of the partnerships in which you are engaged, this one should not be treated by merely saying, can't we be nicer to each other? This one is a time when the Jewish community leadership and our rabbis should be taking a stand. The stand in any case should be pro-Israel, because Israel is more important than to be left to the whims and horse trading of politicians. We need to understand what's at stake, understand what Yuval Noah Harari understood. This is the most important historic moment that Israel has been facing since 1948. And understand that our role is active supporters and proponents of a strong Jewish and democratic Israel, in which the principles of the Declaration of Independence for religious freedom and equality and full social and political rights, regardless of religion, gender, or race, are a full reality, in which the rule of law is paramount, in which a strong and independent judiciary is a prerequisite. Thank you.